You didn't miss the signs. The signs were hidden, and there's a difference.
You're listening to Unbound Presents Dangerous Minds. Beth Curry talks about whatever the hell she wants. And this time, what she wants to talk about is psychopaths, narcissists, killers, and the people who made them that way. You asked for it, repeatedly. Here's hoping you can handle it.
Welcome back to Dangerous Minds. I'm Beth Curry. Yesterday, I went through the labels. Psychopathy, narcissism, ASPD, BPD, emotional violence, what they are, what they aren't, why precision matters when we're talking about patterns that cause real harm to real people. Today I'm going behavioral. Specifically, I'm going to talk about the predatory behavior. I had a lot of personal experience with this when I was a teenager. It started when I was quite young, 13. Stalking, coercive control, the escalation patterns that forensic risk assessment is built to identify, what it looks like from inside the experience, what it looks like from the outside, and what the research actually tells us about when, why, and how it gets worse. Like I alluded to yesterday, this is the episode where my forensic background is most visible, and also the episode where, my personal shit kind of becomes clearer. So I've been in this forensic space long enough to know that the hardest part about talking about predatory behavior is the part how ordinary it looks at the start. And I don't mean that as a dramatic observation. I mean it literally. The beginnings of the most serious cases I've encountered were almost without exception completely unremarkable. Same with my own. That's the whole design of it, and that's what I want to talk about today. So I'm going to start with the definition because predatory is a word that gets used a lot and means different things in different contexts. So in forensic and clinical psychology, predatory behavior refers to behavior that is planned and purposeful and directed at a specific target for the purpose of gaining something, whether it's control or access, maybe gratification or power. And it's distinguished from impulsive or reactive aggression, that kind that erupts in the moment in response to a perceived threat or provocation, right? By the presence of premeditation and the absence of emotional arousal driving it. So predatory aggression is icy cold and reactive aggression is hot, okay? And the difference between the two matters because, both clinically and legally, it matters enormously. Most of the violence that dominates headlines, the dramatic and explosive and high emotion incidents, it's reactive. It's terrible. Really, but it's also, like in a forensic sense, relatively legible. Something happened, someone snapped. There's a comprehensible, if not excusable, emotional chain of events there. But predatory behavior is different. It unfolds over time, right? It's organized, it's patient, and it is specifically designed to be invisible to the target and to observers, sometimes even to the perp themselves. They may not consciously frame what they're doing in those terms. And this is the point where I want to say something directly to anyone listening who's currently trying to work out whether what their experience is serious enough to be called predatory. The question I want you to ask is, not how dramatic it is. I want you to ask, does it feel like it's organized around you? Like someone is paying very close attention to your movements or your responses or maybe your vulnerabilities and using that information. Because that orientation, that quality of focused, purposeful attention is the thing that distinguishes predatory behavior from difficult behavior. And you're allowed to trust your nervous system when it tells you something's wrong, okay? I'm going to talk about stalking for a second. Stalking is one of the most well-researched areas in forensic psychology, and the findings consistently contradict the popular image of it, okay? So the popular image is a stranger obsessed, watching from a distance, and a threat arrives from outside. But the research shows that the majority of stalking victims know their stalker. In studies across multiple countries, between 60 and 80% of stalking cases involve a former intimate partner. The most dangerous stalking cases, the ones most likely to escalate to physical violence, are almost always ex-partner cases, not strangers, people who were at some point trusted. This matters because it means that stalking is not primarily a stranger danger problem. It is primarily a domestic and intimate partner problem, okay? And the risk factors that predict escalation are closely tied to the dynamics of prior relationship. The Mullen typology, developed by forensic psychiatrist Paul Mullen and widely used in risk assessment, categorizes stalkers into 5 types. There's the rejected stalker, the resentful stalker, the intimacy seeker, the incompetent suitor, and the predatory stalker. So the rejected stalker is the most common and in intimate partner contexts, the most dangerous. Okay. This is the individual who cannot tolerate the end of a relationship, who experiences the loss of the partner, not just as grief, but as an annihilation of self. Okay. A humiliation that demands a response. And the stalking behavior is simultaneously an attempt to restore the relationship and to punish the person for ending it. Sometimes both at the same time. The predatory stalker is the least common, but the most forensically significant. So this individual is not in emotional distress about the target. They're planning. Their surveillance and monitoring serves a specific purpose, usually sexual violence. And there is little to no emotional ambivalence about the target as a person. The target is merely an object. It's a goal, That's a chilling thing to say, but it's pretty accurate as well. I want to stop here and say, if you've ever experienced stalking by a former partner, what I just described about rejected stalkers is probably very recognizable. The way it doesn't feel like one thing, it flips between what feels almost like love and something that feels like pure threat. That ambiguity is not a sign that you're misreading it. It's part of the pattern itself. And that oscillation between pursuit and punishment is characteristic, okay? It's not evidence they still care about you in a way that makes you safe. It's evidence of the opposite. So keep that in mind. The behavioral indicators that forensic risk assessment looks for in stalking cases include escalating frequency of contact attempts, physical proximity seeking, surveillance of home or workplace, maybe contact with the victim's network, explicit or implicit threats, property damage, and any prior history of violence in the relationship. So each of those factors individually raises concern. Okay, in combination, they indicate significantly elevated risk. And the factor that research most consistently identifies as the strongest predictor of escalation to physical violence in stalking cases is the victim attempting to end contact. So the moment of attempting to disengage is the highest risk moment, not the middle of the stalking, the exit, which is why safety planning, something I'm going to talk about in part 5, is not a bureaucratic exercise. It's a forensic necessity. Okay. Coercive control. So this is kind of like the architecture of entrapment. In 2015, coercive control became a criminal offense in England and Wales. Scotland followed. Several other jurisdictions have introduced or are introducing similar legislation. This is relatively recent, and it matters because for a long-ass time, the law only recognized physical violence as domestic abuse, which meant that a very large proportion of the most damaging intimate partner abuse was effectively invisible to the legal system. What in the world? Evan Stark, sociologist and forensic social worker who developed the coercive control framework, describes it as a pattern of behavior that seeks to take away the victim's liberty or freedom and strip away their sense of self. Okay, it's not a single incident. It's a system, and it's an ongoing pattern of domination that operates through a combination of tactics designed to isolate, control, and undermine. And the tactics of coercive control include isolation, systematically severing the victim's connections to support networks, family, friends, colleagues. This is rarely done overtly at first. It just kind of starts with these subtle criticism of the people in the victim's life. And there's manufactured conflict, and socializing is been made difficult or costly until the victim's world is quietly kind of contracted around the perpetrator. Another one is monitoring and surveillance. So tracking movements, checking phones, demanding accountability for time, showing up unexpectedly. The surveillance serves two purposes. It provides the perp with information, and it communicates to the victim that they are always being watched. And the latter is often more important than the former. There's micro-regulation, so control over the details of daily life, what the victim wears, eats, spends, says, how they present themselves in public. This is one of the features of coercive control that victims often find hardest to describe to others because individually each instance sounds trivial, right? It's the accumulation and the pervasiveness that constitutes the abuse. There's financial control, controlling access to money, sabotaging employment, creating financial dependency. Economic abuse is one of the most significant barriers to leaving. and one of the most reliably underreported features of coercive control. Gaslighting. It's another one. Another overused word, but this is the deliberate manipulation of the victim's perception of reality. So, denying things that happened or reframing the victim's responses to abuse as the actual problem. Maybe creating an environment of chronic self-doubt in which the victim's own perceptions cannot be trusted. This is, in my view, one of the most psychologically devastating features of coercive control because it attacks the tool you need most to get out, and that's your own judgment. I know someone, I've talked about this person before, who had someone gaslighting him for years and years and really messed him up. I'm going to get personal for a minute. I've experienced gaslighting too, not in the way that the word gets used casually. Oh, he told me I was overreacting kind, that's its own problem, but a different one. I mean, the sustained, systematic kind, where your reality is so consistently rewritten by someone else that you begin to genuinely wonder if you can trust your own memory. I remember a specific moment I understood what had been happening. I was reading something, a clinical description or actually in a professional context. And I had this very strange experience of reading about myself from the outside. And the primary feeling was not anger. It was just like this sense of relief, I guess, because it had a name and because other people had experienced it, because I wasn't crazy. That moment is part of why I feel so strongly about giving people accurate language for their experiences. The right word can be the beginning of the way out, for sure. The profile of perpetrators of coercive control does not fit a single diagnostic category either. Coercive control is found across personality presentations in individuals with narcissistic features, psychopathic features, and in individuals who would not meet criteria for any personality disorder at all. What it requires is not a diagnosis. What it requires is a belief that the partner exists to serve the perp's needs and a willingness to use whatever tools are available to enforce that. Which is a chilling thing about coercive control. It doesn't require pathology. It requires entitlement. And entitlement, unfortunately, in this world today, 2026, is not scarce at all. Now, one of the most important concepts in forensic risk assessment is escalation. This is the idea that harmful behavior does not usually begin at its worst point. It moves toward its worst point through a series of stages. Each of which contains information about where things are heading, right? Understanding escalation is useful for two reasons. First, it allows for earlier identification of risk, okay? Second, it dismantles the narrative that dangerous behavior appears without warning, a narrative that tends to result in victims being blamed for not seeing it coming. The research on escalation in intimate partner violence identifies several consistent patterns. So there's frequency increases. So what begins as an occasional incident becomes more regular. The intervals between these incidents kind of shorten, and the threshold for triggering an incident lowers. The severity also increases. The behavior at each incident becomes more extreme. The methods more varied. The perpetrator becomes more confident, often because consequences have not materialized, right? Control also increases. So as the relationship progresses, the range of behaviors the perp seeks to control expands. And the micro-regulation I described before, and like when I was talking about coercive control, extends further into the victim's life. The isolation deepens. Minimization increases. So paradoxically, as the behavior escalates, the perp's narrative about it often becomes more insistent in its minimization, right? The incidents are kind of reframed as the victim's fault or as misunderstandings or, as evidence of the victim's instability. And this serves a function because it manages the victim's response and maintains the relationship as a context in which the abuse can continue. There's a thing that happens in escalating relationships that I think is one of the cruelest features of the whole damn dynamic. The escalation is gradual enough that your reference point shifts, right? So what would have been acceptable at the beginning of the relationship becomes normal, not because you're naive or weak or any of that, but because the human nervous system adapts to its environment. So you recalibrate every time. And then one day you describe something to a friend outside the relationship and you see their face and you realize, oh shit, that's not normal. That was never normal. I recalibrated around something that was never okay. Um, that moment of external reflection, a friend or a professional, maybe just a book or a podcast, is often kind of what begins that process of getting out, which is one of the reasons I make this content, because sometimes the mirror matters. The forensic risk assessment tools that are used to evaluate escalation risk in intimate partner violence cases, tools like the DASH risk assessment, Sarah, the Ontario domestic assault risk assessment, they're all built around these patterns. They assess frequency, severity, history of strangulation, use of weapons, threats to kill, access to weapons, a drug or substance abuse, and other mental health factors. Not because any one factor is determinative, right? But because the combination of factors across a pattern paints this picture that individual incidents can't. Strangulation, in particular, is a factor that I want to highlight because research consistently identifies it as one of the strongest predictors of homicide in intimate partner violence cases. Non-fatal strangulation, choking, increases the risk of subsequent homicide by approximately 7 times. So if strangulation has occurred in a relationship, that is a forensic red flag of the highest order. Full stop. So don't forget that. So what victims experience, why they stay, I want to spend some time here because I think the public misunderstanding of why victims stay in dangerous situations causes enormous harm. It feeds victim blaming. It creates barriers to disclosure, and it fundamentally misrepresents the psychology of what is actually happening. I got asked this a lot during season 3. People constantly ask this on TV, in real life, whatever. The question, why didn't they just leave, is from a forensic and psychological perspective, almost perfectly the wrong question. Not because leaving isn't important, it is, but because it locates the problem in the victim's behavior rather than in the perpetrators, and because it profoundly underestimates the complexity of what leaving actually involves. Okay? Victims in coercive control and intimate partner violence stay or return after leaving for a range of reasons that are entirely coherent given their circumstances. Some of the things this might include fear. Leaving is the highest risk moment. As I said earlier, many victims know this intuitively, even without the research to back it up. They are not wrong to be afraid. There's also trauma bonding. So prolonged exposure to an intermittent pattern of threat and relief, abuse followed by remorse, and tension followed by reconciliation, creates a powerful neurochemical attachment that it's pretty strong. And it's a documented psychological response to a specific pattern of stress. And it is, in its own way, a survival adaptation. There's also isolation. By the time leaving becomes the question, the perp has frequently done significant work to ensure the victim has nowhere to go. No support network, no financial resources, no confidence in their own perceptions, right? Leaving requires resources. There's financial, practical, emotional, all that stuff. That coercive control is specifically designed to deplete. Hope. It's another one. The person who was charming at the beginning has not entirely disappeared. They resurface strategically, often right at the point where the victim is considering leaving. The reconciliation phase of the cycle is real. It offers relief, and the human capacity for hope, particularly in attachment relationships, isn't a sign of their lack of strength or their weakness. It's like, under different circumstances, one of our finest qualities as human beings, right? Now, I'm not going to sit here and pretend I've never been the person asking a version of, but why didn't you just leave? Even internally, even about my own situation. It's an almost reflexive thought, of course, and unpacking why it's the wrong question took me time and a fair amount of professional reading that I was doing for ostensibly professional reasons. The honest version is leaving is terrifying. Okay. It's complicated. I did leave. I left, and then I was stalked, and this went on for 5.5 years for me. It requires you to trust your own perception of reality at the exact moment someone has spent this considerable energy convincing you that your perception can't be trusted. It's not simple. It was never simple. And anyone who tells you it is has never been inside of it at all. So I want to close this episode with something practical, of course. It's what I do. And because the series is not just academic, it's for people who are in situations or who have been in situations or who are watching someone they love navigate one. The early warning signs of predatory and coercive dynamics, like before the escalation happens and before the full architecture is in place, they're recognizable if you know what you're looking for. And I want you to know what you're looking for. Okay. So start with there's like this intensity that moves too fast. The early relationship that just feels really friggin' extraordinary. The person who's almost immediately convinced you are the most important person in their world. They push for commitment and exclusivity or cohabitation before a normal relationship timeline would suggest it. What presents as passion is sometimes urgency. And that urgency is to establish access before you have had time to evaluate them properly. There's boundary testing, small violations early, pushing past a limit you've set, watching how you respond to things, recalibrating. This is information gathering. It's also a test of whether you will enforce your own limits. Each boundary crossed without consequence is a green light for that person, okay? There's also the gradual introduction of criticism. It's kind of disguised as concern. I just worry about you when you drink, or your friends don't really appreciate you the way I do. I notice you seem stressed when you spend time with your family. So each statement is individually deniable, right? Collectively, they're an erosion strategy. There's also jealousy framed as love. So possessiveness that is presented as evidence of how much they care. Like early in a relationship, this can feel flattering. Sure, it's worth asking who benefits from this framing, you or them. There's also the privatization of the relationship. Many of these things are also what this person I have alluded to before, I've talked about them before, went through in a former relationship. This happened there too. A gradual sense that the relationship is somehow separate from the rest of your life and that things that happen within it stay within it, and disclosing difficulties to others is a betrayal. This is what happens, the things that happens between you, it's nobody else's business. Healthy relationships are not secret. Okay? Not at all. Unhealthy ones frequently are. And I want to be clear that having one of these things in a relationship does not make it abusive. People are complicated and relationships are imperfect. But if you're listening to this list and ticking boxes, and if you're recognizing a pattern, not a single incident, I want you to talk to someone, a friend, a professional, a helpline, whatever's accessible to you. Not because I'm trying to make a catastrophe out of it on your behalf, but because early is better every time in every case I've ever seen. The people who wish they'd acted earlier vastly outnumber the people who wish they waited. Tomorrow, part 4, I'm going to go to the extreme end of the spectrum. The fun stuff, murder, serial killers, mass murderers, spree killers. The psychology behind the cases is kind of stop us in our tracks. What separates them from ordinary violence, and what the mythology gets wrong, and what the research actually shows about who these people are and how they got there. It's the episode I'm going to be most careful about, the things that I say and stuff, because the extreme end of the spectrum deserves precision and not spectacle. Thanks so much for listening. And if you want to support the show, production costs, or the time it takes me to research and develop these shows for you, info's in the show notes. You can also rate, review, and share these episodes on your social media or with your friends. It all makes a difference. I will see you tomorrow for murder.
That's Dangerous Minds Unbound Off Script for people with slightly concerning taste in podcasts. Unbound is free to listen to. Show notes have everything you need if you want to support the show or get in touch with Beth. Thanks for listening. Probably says something about you that you made it this far. We mean that as a compliment.